heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 347, covering the week of March 6th through March 10th, 2023. Glad to have you back on the program. Very glad to be here. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter, like our Gab and Facebook pages, and subscribe to our YouTube page. You can find all those social media accounts on our webpage, abbevilleinstitute.org. That's ABBEVILLE institute.org. While you're there, give us an email address. We'll give you a free ebook exploring the Southern tradition written by 20 Abbeville Institute scholars. Our gift to you just for giving us that email address. And of course, our email list is invaluable because it's how we let you know about things that are going on in the Institute. So don't unsubscribe. You're going to get an email usually about once a day during the week, sometimes twice a day, and sometimes on the weekends. But this is how we let you know about our conferences. We give you our article once a day, the articles we put out on the website. So it's not too excessive, but it is our communication tool. We don't know all these other social media accounts, everything else, how things can be censored or shut down. So our email list is important for us to stay in touch with you. Now, we do exist on your generous contributions alone, so if you like everything we do, our podcasts, our website, our conferences, our Zoom webinars, our books, all the things that we produce at the Institute, please consider a tax-deductible donation to the Institute. It is the only way we stay in business, so you can donate monthly, annually, or a one-time gift. We appreciate all of your support and all of your financial contributions. Now, a few things. We do have our conference coming up. If you're getting this on March 10th, before March 13th, we have our April 20th anniversary conference coming up. This is the last time you're going to be able to sign up for this thing. It is a hard deadline, March 13th. So, if you're hearing it, head on over to abbevilleinstitute.org, click on the events page, and sign up for the conference. This is it. Once we close registration, we cannot open it up. We have a hard deadline. So, if you want to come out to this conference, it is going to be a fantastic time. We have 11 great speakers lined up. Plus, we're going to have time in Callaway Gardens in Pine Mountain, Georgia. We got some other things that we're doing too. So this is going to be a really fantastic time and a great opportunity for you to meet lots of great people and compatriots from the Abbeville Institute. So head over to abbevilleinstitute.org, click on the events tab again, and look at that event. And hopefully we'll see you there. But we also have, of course, our Zoom webinars. If you missed any of the old Zoom webinars from last year, you can catch those on abbevilleacademy.org. Of course, you have to pay a fee to get them because we charged for them last year. Now they're free. So head over to abbevilleacademy.org and purchase one or a dozen of those past webinars. They're a great educational opportunity, and they're cheap. I mean, they're $15. So it really is a win-win for you to pick them up there at abbevilleacademy.org. All right, well, let's talk about the topic for this particular podcast. I want to focus today entirely on the piece that Valerie Protopappas wrote for this week, Memorials to a Lie. And I want to focus on this piece because this is a big issue now in 2023. It has been a big issue since essentially 2015, but in the last 3 years, 3 to 4 years, we've seen a lot more focus on Confederate memorials and Confederate monuments from the left. And we know that the Naming Commission, which was a part of a defense spending bill that was vetoed, I should say, by Donald Trump and then pushed through the Congress by the Republicans, by the way, but goes into law. Trump vetoes it. The Congress overrides his veto. And one of the reasons he overrode the veto, or one of the reasons he vetoed it, was because of this part of the bill. It's one of the noble things that Trump did while in office. It created this naming commission. The naming commission actually recommended that the Arlington Confederate Monument be removed. And so this was, of course, outside the purview of the naming commission. They were supposed not to touch anything in cemeteries. This is in a cemetery, but they did it anyways. They, of course, made a whole lot of other stupid recommendations, but apparently the United States military and the Pentagon are already fast at work trying to implement these changes. But the monument's a little different situation, and there is an effort underway by a legal organization to try to block this and to file a lawsuit and an injunction trying to get it done. There is a hearing coming up on this where people can actually voice their opposition to it. I don't know how much good that's going to do. Of course, there was a group, Save Arlington, that produced a series of white papers, which yours truly participated in. And of course, we produced a video on that at Abbeville Institute to try to get some attention to this issue. But we know, and of course, there are some rumors that the cranes are showing up next week to take down the monument. And it's probably a Hail Mary to get this thing stopped at this point, which is tragic. I mean, the Arlington Confederate Monument is one of the most beautiful Confederate monuments in the United States, and it was produced at a time of reconciliation. And that's what the piece that Ms. Protopappas wrote is all about. Reconciliation. What does that mean? And should that even be something that Southerners are pursuing, reconciliation? Because it is a loaded term. Now, from my perspective, it's about the best we've got at this particular point, trying to insist that these monuments were put up during a reconciliationist period. That appeals to people who may not really be vested in this issue or really that interested in the issue. But if you say, look, these things were put up because there were people, both sides, that were interested in shaking hands across the chasm, so to speak. They were interested in putting the war behind them and moving forward, but still remembering the dead on both sides. Well, I mean, that's a positive message for people. And so generally the white papers that have been produced and the articles, of course, we had an individual on Tucker Carlson, not from the Abbeville Institute, but there was an individual on Tucker Carlson talking about this. Generally, that's been the attitude that's worked best to try to persuade people to go against these particular actions of the Naming Commission. Of course, we also know this is why I think that it's probably a foregone conclusion this is coming down, that there was a yearly in June, there was an individual who had a Memorial Day celebration in June at the Arlington Confederate Monument, and this individual has now been told that they can't have it there. So they had the permit, but the Defense Department has now informed them that they had to move it. So this is why, of course, I think that it's pretty much a foregone conclusion that the monument is coming down. No matter how much people complain about it, I think that it's probably going to come down. Now, a legal injunction could help, maybe, and there should be some kind of effort made to stop this stuff. But and people are doing that. They're putting everything they have into this to try to stop this monument from coming down. We know that there has been some success in other areas in blocking monuments from being removed, but those are in local areas, and this is the highest profile monument that perhaps could be blocked from being removed. Of course, all the monuments in Richmond Avenue came down. We did a wonderful Zoom webinar on that this year. You can go out and catch those on YouTube. It's a great webinar, and we had an art historian on there to talk about how important that Monument Avenue was in Richmond as an artistic, aesthetic part of the city. And of course, that's all been removed. There's nothing left. And it's just tragic what's happening. But Ms. Protopappas takes this position from another perspective, or takes this issue from another perspective. And that is, the title is Memorials to a Lie. And she calls reconciliation a lie. That it never was something that Unionists were really interested in, that Northerners were really interested in. They weren't really interested in reconciliation. And should Southerners have been interested in reconciliation? In other words, should Southerners have accepted the terms that came out of reconciliation? So after the war is over, of course, we have a period of time, Reconstruction. It's a very volatile political period. There was a lot of violence in the South. And I think that we forget that, and how people really were not very much interested in shaking hands and putting these things behind them for a time. Southerners looked at the Union people as occupiers, that they had come in and usurped their government. And so And then, of course, you had the volatile issue of race relations in the South and what was going to happen there. We had both white and black Southerners doing their best to deal with that situation. And you can understand the tug back and forth from these two groups as they wrestled with these new conditions in the South. We know that Northerners weren't really interested in doing much overall with freedmen. They were essentially blocked from the Western territories. We know northern states had prohibited them from voting even after the war was over. So this was a pretty difficult situation no matter where you were in the United States. People were wrestling with this new reality of America. We, of course, had 3 amendments added to the Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. There was opposition to all 3 of those amendments. Well, not the 13th as much, but the 14th and 15th definitely. In the North even, there was opposition to those amendments because they thought these things would fundamentally transform America. And so this wasn't just an issue where the South was trying to block these noble Northerners from doing something. There were Northerners who were also not necessarily on board with this new America. But of course, all those things happen. The amendments get ratified, 14th Amendment illegally, but regardless, it's ratified according to history. And we have a new America born. And this is what leftist historians have generally focused on now, that the old Constitution was done, the new Constitution now is in effect, the 14th Amendment Constitution, the 1868 Constitution essentially. And this is how I think we should describe this. The original Constitution died in 1868 when the 14th Amendment is ratified. And why? Well, because according to leftist legal scholars, well, that transformed America from a federal republic to a national republic. It centralized power. It destroyed the states in terms of what they could do to arrest the federal government. If you follow their line of thinking, it incorporated the Bill of Rights. And so now the states really had they just became administrative subdivisions of the general government. They were there to do what the general government wanted them to do. And if you look at so many issues now in America, this is what happens. So we have a transformative period in America, a real pivot in the 1860s. And Southerners were, of course, the section that was gumming up the works. They were trying to oppose these things. And of course, it's always said because of race, but they talked about all kinds of other things too, whatever fashionable ism of the day was being used. This is where R.L. Dabney said that Northern conservatism is not really conservative at all. It's just simply adopting the discarded revolutionary principles of the left, of their opponents, and adopting them as their own as their opponents have moved on to something even more radical. And we see that throughout America all the time. But as Ms. Protopapas points out, in order to get reconciliation, there had to be some concessions by the South. And right around the turn of the 20th century, this was the consensus position. You see, if you look at histories written right after the war, you have pretty partisan histories. You have Southerners writing histories. These are called the lost cause narratives, of course. But Southerners are writing histories about the war. And then you have a reaction to that from Northerners and even Europeans like von Holst, who are writing histories that are completely against those positions. And some of these actually started during the war, like Carnes' history of secession and what it was. He, of course, was a Brit. But you had certain Northerners, Europeans, writing these histories that focused entirely on the issue of slavery. So you have these two competing schools that are now waging this war, essentially, through the written word. Well, right around the turn of the century, you start looking at a reconciliationist period. And that reconciliationist period was marked by certain concessions on the South and perhaps certain concessions from the North. The only concessions Northerners really made in this reconciliation period was that Southerners were heroic. Southern soldiers fought against dire odds and did what they thought was right. That Southern men like Lee and Jackson should be considered American heroes, not just Southern heroes. So it was a concession. Jefferson Davis was not going to be spit on any longer. That Southerners will be recognized as Americans. This was a conflict that should not have happened, but it did happen, and we should respect these people as being part of this American story, and that these people really were good soldiers and good warriors. That's what Northerners were willing to concede. In fact, you look at even in the middle of the 20th century, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, these people are considered American heroes. You've got them on wall calendars, all kinds of things, little pamphlets, little books made about them. So you've got, from insurance companies, you've got this kind of reverence for the South that would just extend essentially to the men who fought. No one would give any concession to the cause itself. So Southerners had to accept certain parts of this reconciliationist message. They're going to be considered Americans again. A lot of this starts to happen in the 1890s with the Spanish-American War. The 1890s, 1898, you get the Spanish-American War, and you've got the United States recruiting in the South to try to get Southerners to go fight the Spanish in Cuba and the Philippines. And so they need Southerners to join the ranks of the Army again. And Southerners were willing to do it. They wanted to be part of this reunified America, and again, shake hands, and we're all back to fighting the same way. And the high point of this was World War I. I mean, that's when really everything was put back together. And of course, right around that time period, you see a real boom in Confederate memorials being constructed. The 1890s, and of course, the 19-teens. Well, why? You've got anniversaries. The 19-teens, you've got the 50th anniversary. Right? The 1890s, you've got about the 25th anniversary, somewhere in there. A little shade after that. But you start seeing more of it in the early 1890s and the 1880s. So, late 1880s. So these are the periods of time that you see the construction of Confederate memorials. And it's all in that process of reconciliation. But what did Southerners have to accept? And this is where Miss Protopappas points this out. They have to accept certain things. One, that secession was wrong. That secession was illegal, secession was treason, or perhaps not treason, but maybe wrong, definitely wrong. And they have to accept that they were wrong in the 1860s, that this should never happen again, that all of these principles of federalism, decentralization, secession, nullification, states' rights, all that has to be swept aside. It was all wrong, and it can never come back again. Southerners had to accept that particular position. Number two, they had to accept that the war was generally about slavery. Now, not entirely about slavery. There was Charles Beard, who's writing in the early 20th century, says that, well, I mean, there was economic motivation here. There were economics involved. But of course, slavery is going to be a big issue, and with tied to that issue of economics, you're going to see slavery as part of that. They couldn't say anything else. That had to be the dominant position, the historical interpretation of the conflict. It had to be about that particular side of it. And number three, Southerners really couldn't complain about Northern war crimes anymore. They couldn't say that what Northerners did in plundering the South and causing great economic damage, structural damage, social damage, all of those things could not be discussed. When I say social damage, I'm talking about the vast numbers of casualties that were caused by this war, men that had one leg, one arm, etc., etc. They couldn't talk about that. They couldn't talk about war crimes, where Southerners were subjected to horrible conditions in Northern prisons. They couldn't talk about any of that. Essentially, that had to be put aside. In other words, the bitterness had to go away. The bitterness could not be there when it came to mainstream American politics and society. Now, we know Southerners were still bitter. On my own show, I talked about Jimmy Carter and Jimmy Carter's book, An Hour Before Daylight, just this week, and how Carter talks about how his grandparents, all they did was talk about the war and the damn Yankees and everything else. I mean, so Southerners could still be bitter privately, but publicly, they couldn't do that. They couldn't raise this flag of disgust and animosity for the North. They couldn't do it. They had to be good Americans, and they had to put all that stuff aside in the name of the United States. In other words, it had to be a complete victory, not just on the battlefield, but in terms of how people accepted the war. You do all those things, and we'll let you put up your monuments. So what's happening now? and I'm going to get into what she says about, the reality of what Southerners had to swallow, the pill they had to swallow here. But what's happening now? Basically, the North is still occupying the same position that the war was about slavery. The Southerners, they've gone back on a couple of the deals, but the war was about slavery, and you can't have any animosity towards the North. You'd be a good American, you got to basically spit on people that you admired in the South and Southern history for fighting for a cause of independence. Now, the bargain has been broken. They've also essentially said that secession was treason. That secession was, you have to agree that it's wrong, but now it's treason. And your ancestors were not heroes. They were fighting for a bad cause, and these people were traitors, and they were bad Americans, and so their memorials need to come down. So essentially you have to accept not just a victory that happened on the battlefield, but a complete victory now, not where you have symbols to these people. Well, we did what we thought was right. No. Everything you did was wrong. We've gone back to basically Reconstruction again. Because during Reconstruction, Southern women were not allowed to put flowers on the graves of their family members who had died. There's a very famous poem by James Ryder Randall where he talks about this going on in Virginia, and these women were shooed off by federal soldiers. And that day, it's a beautiful poem, that day there was a storm, and all the flowers that had been put on the Union graves blew over to the Confederate graves and marked their graves, and all the Union graves were not covered in flowers. But we also know that Southern women who drove this earliest part of reconciliation, right? This was their idea. They were putting flowers on the graves of Union soldiers as well, not just Confederate soldiers, but Union soldiers. It was women who were driving this cause of reconciliation, because women understood the cost of all this as well as men, if not better than men, because you had so many men that didn't come home, whether it was fathers, brothers, husbands, sons. And it was devastating socially. There's women that never stopped wearing black in the years after the war because they were mourning for all of the people that died in that war. It was, and all the people that were gravely wounded and everything else. This was a tragic period. We forget that. And so these monuments were there to recognize the tragedy of the entire thing. To them, it wasn't just the bargain. It was a monument to mourning, right? It was something that these people were great men, but we mourn what's happened because of all this. So, that's the deal that now has been essentially canceled. There is no reconciliation anymore. It's gone. The naming commission is essentially burying it. And all the efforts by every group that's out there, and even conservatives who say these things need to come down, this is what they're doing. They're essentially adopting the northern position right after the war and saying this is what needs to happen now. These rebels, these traitors need to be buried in the dust, and nothing needs to come back from that. And so people that were against this, people saying, no, we need to still have reconciliation. We need to still have these monuments up. Even if you don't agree with who these people were, they need to be recognized. These are Americans. You're still living in a reconciliationist period that all of these leftists have moved on from. So that's the real issue right now. And of course, Valerie Miss Protopappas brings out all kinds of great information in this particular piece. You need to go over and read it about the real tragedies that took place in the war, particularly when it comes to the punishment Southerners received during the war itself at the hands of the Union Army, and how it was something that was, almost heroic to be able to swallow this kind of pill and say that you can't talk about these things anymore. These things are going to be pushed aside. You were the ones who were committing war crimes at Andersonville. These were things that you were doing, not us. When you look at the federal prisons, for example, and you look at Elmira Prison in New York, 24% death rate there. You look at Camp Douglas in Chicago. And there are people that have written about these things, not from the South, but from the North. There's a very famous book by a guy named Levy, To Die in Chicago. And he was just interested. He's from Chicago. He's just interested in what happened to this camp. And his research leads him down a path where he says, this was an extermination camp. There was willful mistreatment and neglect by the Union government, by the United States government for these Confederate prisoners. And what are we doing? I mean, why don't we talk about this? Why do we focus just on Southern prisons and having, bad conditions when we know that Southerners were suffering under the same conditions, when Northerners could do better? Fort Delaware, horrible prisoner of war camp on a little island is called Pea Patch Island near Wilmington, Delaware. It's a horrible camp. People were having to drink mosquito-infested water, the larvae in the water, that's what they had. Whereas the officers that ran the camp, the guards themselves, were getting nice meals. I mean, these people were being essentially starved to death with very little supply. The people of Wilmington were trying to get supplies sent into them. They were doing it at their own money. Can you just let us send supplies to this? And they were denied over and over again. It was willful mistreatment, no medicine, no blankets. And in Chicago, in Camp Douglas, they actually denied them warm clothing in those very cold Chicago winters. They had sub-zero temperatures, and these men were freezing to death. They didn't have food. They didn't have enough rations. Again, on purpose. So why don't we talk about those things? Well, because of reconciliation. Because you can't talk about those things. So if you're going to talk about those things, that kind of breaks the deal for Northerners. And of course, they're going to poo-poo this and say, well, those people deserved it. They all deserved it. They were traitors. They deserved worse than this. These people were fighting for an immoral cause. They deserved worse than this. These were Nazis, essentially, is the position that these Northerners take, which we know that's a false argument. It's one of the most idiotic arguments out there. But that was part of it. You couldn't talk about these things. And of course, Miss Protopappas brings this up. Or how about Sherman's treatment? And not just Sherman, I mean, he's the most conspicuous, but you had other efforts in other parts of the South that were highly destructive. Sheridan's raid through the Shenandoah Valley, Sherman's march through Georgia. Also, you had a similar march through Alabama, North Alabama, into Columbus, Georgia, and they were going to join up. This is James Harrison Wilson coming in from North Alabama through Columbus, Georgia. Columbus, Georgia was burned. When the war was already over, Columbus, Georgia was burned. They didn't know. The battle took place a week after Lee had surrendered at Appomattox. On Easter Sunday, in fact, you had a very nasty battle of Columbus, Georgia, and after the battle was over, after the city had already surrendered, it was burned. It was burned. Well, who's going to suffer in that? Not just Confederate soldiers, because most of them had gotten out of town by that point, but the civilians, the citizens of Columbus, black and white. What about Charleston being zeroed in on for over a year by Union artillery, Union gunboats, and just using it as target practice? This is what they did. You have this very famous image of these African Americans sitting on in the rubble of Charleston. Well, why? Well, because they were living there. I mean, what about Vicksburg, where civilians were in caves in the hills around Vicksburg, and they were shelled constantly, and civilians were killed by that? What about these things that go on, these kind of tactics, which would violate, as Ms. Protopappas points out, the Lieber Code? They would violate the Lieber Code. They would violate what people thought was, even at that time, was acceptable rules of warfare. We can't talk about that anymore because we have the glorious Union and we have this righteous cause myth now foisted on America. You see, that is the entire point of this exercise. You can't have a more balanced interpretation of the war that actually treats Southerners as humans in this entire conflict. Yes, there were bad things happening on both sides. Yes, slavery is dead and gone. Thankfully, it's dead and gone. Even Southerners said that. Now, there were some that would say, no, we still wanted this to continue. There was people after the war that would say these things. But regardless, we had this period where you could actually have a complex view. And you do have some legal scholars now, legal lawyers who are going out there and looking at these issues and looking at secession and actually saying, perhaps the South actually had a pretty strong argument here that secession wasn't illegal. That it wasn't illegal, that Lincoln's argument was simply a political argument, that Chase and the Texas v. White decision was making a political argument, not a legal argument. And they're taking these things seriously. That's another amazing part of all this, because you've got these mainstream historians who are just a bunch of dopes. Now secession's treason. Secession's treason. But yet you've got legal scholars looking at it and saying, well, maybe it wasn't. Maybe it wasn't treason. Maybe there was something going on. Maybe it wasn't that. Maybe there was something about this that was bigger than what these people actually accept. So I like this piece from Miss Protopappas, and it's really good. You should go out there and read it. It gives you a nice perspective on maybe this reconciliation was a lie from the beginning. Maybe what Southerners had to accept was still a lie. Maybe there wasn't really any reconciliation in the heart of the North. This was just a pause and a way to get Southerners out there and fighting for the United States again and agreeing to what the United States government wanted to do, essentially duping Southerners into this for their own benefit, and that Southerners shouldn't have accepted the deal. And when you look at it that way, when you look at maybe what Southerners would have said about naming military bases after them or these kind of things, maybe they wouldn't have wanted that anyways. Who knows? We know that Southerners did want monuments put up because it happened, and we know we had former soldiers, veterans there at these memorials, and they were proud of them. So we know that they were willing to accept parts of this for that. So regardless, this is an interesting piece, and I wanted to cover it in an interesting perspective, maybe a different perspective on reconciliation and what it means, whether we should accept it or not. I'm still on the side that this is the best argument we have at this particular time to try to keep some of these monuments up. And Americans, if you present it in terms of, look, this was William McKinley wanted this monument. A Union veteran, a man that was actually shot at by Confederates, wanted something for Confederates in Arlington Cemetery. William Howard Taft, same thing. He wanted this monument there. So when you come at it from that perspective, I think it gives you a much stronger argument in keeping these things up. And look, there's a Confederate monument in Oakwood Cemetery in Chicago, and you have a mass grave under that for all these Confederates that were just simply starved to death at Camp Douglas. Grover Cleveland attended that ceremony, the President of the United States. So you had, and he was a New Yorker, you had people north and south that wanted these monuments up across the United States because they had gone through such a hard time, and they wanted to show the men that suffered and died, and of course people that suffered and died, not just the soldiers themselves, but the entire civilian population, that there was going to be a memorial to this, and that we were going to mourn what happened there. That's all gone. When you take these monuments down, that's what you're tearing down. Until next time, good day.